Well, I can't really avoid it any longer. We need to start writing our data access layer. Now, this isn't going to be a masterpiece of a multi-layered enterprise class system. This is a simple CMS, so we are going to keep things simple. But we are still also going to separate our concerns, because that just makes our lives a lot easier. For our blog posts, we are going to create a blog post repository. If you're not familiar with the repository pattern, it's very simple. It's simply something that allows us to get something, to update something, to add something to it, or to delete. And really nothing else. It's a very simple concept. So inside of our app code folder, let's add a new folder called data. And we are going to put all of our classes that are involved with data access inside of this data folder. So let's add a new class called blog post repository. And we're not going to worry about interfaces or anything like that. We are keeping things simple. We're just going to write a blog post repository class. Inside of this repository class, we are going to use the database class in order to interact with the database. So the first thing that we need to give this class is a private variable to contain the connection string, or at least the name of the connection string. So let's make this private string, and let's just call it underscore connection string. And we can go ahead and set that as default connection here if we wanted to. And in fact, we should make this read only because we do not want this value to be changed throughout the lifetime of a blog post repository object. So we have this read only connection string that we can then use whenever we need to interact with the database. Well, so far we have retrieved things from the database. So let's write a couple of methods that are going to get blog posts from our repository. The first thing we should do is provide methods for retrieving a blog post based upon the ID or based upon the slug. So let's start with public, and this is going to be a return type of dynamic because we are dealing with dynamic objects. And let's call this just simply get. And this will have an integer for the parameter, for the ID. And the first thing we want to do is create our database connection. So we will use the database class, and we will call open, and then we will pass in our underscore connection string variable. And then we simply want to query the database for a blog post with the specified ID. So let's first of all create our SQL statement. We want to select all from posts where ID is equal to a parameter. And you know what? Let's change the name of this from blog post repository to simply post repository because we haven't really specified what these posts are. So let's make that quick little change from blog post to post, and then let's turn our attention back to the get method. Okay, so we have our SQL statement. Now we simply want to query the database. So we can return DB, and we want to query single because we are wanting a single object, and we want to pass our SQL statement and then the ID for the value of our parameter. And that will give us whatever we need. Now, this might return null, but that's okay. That is expected behavior. So let's copy this code, let's paste it, and let's change the parameter from an integer to a string, and let's also call it slug. This way we can retrieve a blog post, or a post rather, based upon the slug. So we need to change the where clause of the SQL statement. We want to check it, or we want to select the post that has a slug equal to the provided value. So then we will simply change ID to slug, and then that will get us what we want. But we should also have a method that gives us a collection of posts. So we want an IEnumerable of dynamic, and let's just call this get all. And we might want to add a parameter here just so that we can filter it, but we can do that at a later time. So we basically want to do the same thing. We want to create our database connection, and then we want to query the database, except in this case, we won't have a where clause. We will simply select all from posts, and instead of using the query single method, we will use the query method, and then we will pass the SQL statement to that. Now, before we go any further, we have a choice to make. All of these methods are not really using instance data. Now, you can make the argument that our connection string is instance data, but really, we can make this a static private variable, and then we can make our get methods and the get all method static, so that we don't have to create a post repository object. We can just use post repository dot and then call get or get all. That would greatly simplify our data access. So let's go ahead and do that. We can always change this if we decide that we want to change it later. So we want private static read-only string underscore connection string, and we don't have anything for the constructor, but we do need to change the methods to a public static method. But that is easy enough to do. We just add the static keyword to these methods, and then we can make these method calls very, very, very easily. So let's go to our post.cs file, and let's find some places where we are retrieving a blog post, and we're not doing anything inside of the CS.html file itself. So let's look at the post handler. And here we are selecting all from posts where slug is equal to the parameters. So this code right here is something that we can do with our new post repository class. However, we don't have the ability to insert anything yet. We will add that later. So let's first of all refactor some of this code so that we are no longer using a database object in order to select information from the database. So on line 35, instead of calling db.querySingle, we want to use our post repository class and then the get method. Then we just simply pass in the slug, and that will give us our result. If it is null still, we want to throw that exception. Otherwise, we will insert a new post. Or, I'm sorry, if it is not null, then we throw the exception. Otherwise, we add that post. So we can get rid of this SQL variable, although it's used down here. But whenever we finish our repository class, we won't have this SQL variable either. Let's move on to the post.cs file, because here we are retrieving a post based upon the slug once again. So we can get rid of basically all of this code except for getting the result and then returning the result or a new post object. So instead of calling db.querySingle, we once again want to use our post repository class. We will use the get method and we will simply pass in the slug. Then if result is not null, we will return that. Otherwise, we will create a new post. So now we can get rid of all of this database code, and that makes the getter for our current property a lot cleaner. And let's see if we have any other database interaction. No, we don't. Now let's add a method that's going to allow us to add a post to our repository. And we kind of have the majority of this code already written inside of our post handler. So let's just grab this code that's creating a database object, and even though we are still getting a post with the given slug, we can remove that whenever we fully implement this add method. Now we can call this method insert or add or anything like that. You'll usually find this method called add. So let's add a public static method. This could return void, and we can always change it if we need to, and we will call it add. Now there are several pieces of information that we need to provide this method. The first is the title, the content, the author ID, and the slug. So let's make this a string title, string content, int author ID, and then string slug. Then we can get rid of the code that is retrieving a blog post. So we can clear out the result variable and also checking to see if result is not null. We have our SQL variable that contains our SQL statement, and then we have the SQL, the title, the content. Let's change this literal of 1 to author ID and then a slug. So we basically have everything that we need. We should also get rid of this context.response.redirect as well. We don't want to do anything inside of the repository that doesn't have anything to do with getting, adding, updating, or deleting posts. So now we have our add method. Let's go back to our post handler, And instead of creating a database object, we will get rid of that. We have our result. We don't need this SQL statement. And instead of calling db.execute, we will use the post repository class, the add method, where we supply the title, the content, the author ID, which we will still leave as 1 for now, and then the slug. Oops. And let's get rid of the call to db.execute. And there we go. So once again, we have cleaned up our code very, very nicely. Now I think we've gotten all of the places where we were dealing with the database class directly. But just to make sure, let's do a search throughout the solution. So if you go to Edit and then Quick Find, we can change this from current document to current project or entire solution. And let's just do a search for database. And this will show us all of the instances of where we have used database. So we can just zoom through all of these. We are in the repository class. Now we're in web config. And everything is okay. So we have successfully taken all of our database code and stuck it inside of our repository class. So now we need to do some other things like editing blog posts. We already have the form to do that because we did that in the previous lesson. However, we do need to add some extra fields to our form because right now we just have the title and the content. So after the content, let's add another field for the slug. Now, I've been thinking about this. It would be nice to be able to edit the slug, but we could also take it a step further. We could also supply a slug so that it doesn't have to be automatically generated. If we supply a slug, then it will be generated for us. If we don't, then we will use whatever is supplied within the text box. And then that way we can edit the slug as we need to. So let's make this the slug. This is going to be an input type of text. And we will call it post slug. And then for the value, we want post.slug. And we also need a field for the date published. So let's add date published. Now for this field, we're going to use jQuery UI because it has a calendar picker. So that whenever the text box gets focus, a little drop-down is going to display, and then the author can choose what date they want the post to be published. Now, it's not going to give us the time and things like that, but the date is going to be sufficient for our needs. So let's give the name of this text box post date published. And then the value needs to be set to post.date published. Now we probably want to do something else here, like formatting it to a specific date format, but we can do that whenever we get to that point. Now we could add a hidden field for the date created, but really we don't need that. That's going to remain within the database. And whenever we write the code that's going to update a post, we're going to leave that column alone. But you know, we still need another field for the author, but we don't have any authors yet. So we're still going to skip on that for now, and we will just hard code the value of 1 as we have done. Okay, so we have filled out this form with just about everything that we need. The title, the content, the slug, and the date published. Now we need to go to our post handler, and we need to add some logic here because this handler is going to allow us to, first of all, add a new post. It's also going to allow us to edit a post. And whichever process is executed is based upon this mode field. So we first of all need to get the mode and then determine what we want to do based upon that mode. So let's create a variable called mode, and we will get that value from the context, request, form, and then mode. We want to do the same thing for the slug, because now that we have a field for the slug, we want to get that value. So we will initially set the variable slug as whatever was in the form. And then we can check to see if slug is empty or null. And if it is, then we can generate the slug with our create slug method. So if not string is null or white space, let's do white space because is null or white space internally calls is null or empty. So if not string slug empty, actually let's make this a test for true, because if it is null or white space, then we do want to create the slug. So here we will simply set slug equal to create slug. And we also need the date published. So date published equals, we will use the context once again, .request.form, and post date published. We also need to change the name of mode to post mode, and we need to change that in the form as well, because I think it's just set to mode. Or you know what, let's leave it as mode because we are already using just plain mode. But we can change slug to post slug. And then once we have all of this information, we can check the value of mode. If mode equals edit, then we want to edit the blog post or the post. So let's write a method called edit post, where we supply the title, the content, the slug, the date published, and the author ID. Let's add an else. We will eventually need an else if. In fact, let's just go ahead and do that. If mode equals new, then we want to create post. So create post, we pass in title, content, slug, date published, and then 1 for the author ID. And then after we edit or create the post, we will redirect back to admin/post. So let's write the create post method first. This will be a private static. Does it need to be private? Yeah, let's make it private. Private static void create post. And we have the title, the content, the slug, the date published, which right now is a string. So string date published, and then int author ID. And then inside of this method, we are going to, first of all, try to get the post. And if the post exists, then we throw our exception. Otherwise, we add the new post, passing in the title, the content, the author ID, which in this case is now a variable, and then the slug. But we also need to pass in the date published, don't we? So let's go to our repository, and for the add method, let's first of all modify the order of these, because we went title string, slug, and then author ID, so let's just keep that pattern. And before the author ID, we also had the date published. So we will have string and then date published. Although at this point, this should really be a nullable date time. So we need to add a date published to our SQL statement. And we need to add another parameter as well. So @ and then 4. But the value for date published is going to go after content. So here we will pass date published, and that should be that. So let's go back to post handler. Let's make sure that we are passing everything that we need to. Now, of course, we get a red squiggly here because we are passing, or we are not passing enough data. So next is the slug, then the date published, which we need to do something with the provided date published string. So for right now, let's just pass null, and then the author ID. And let's go ahead and parse out date published. So if date published is null or empty, then it of course is null. So let's create a nullable date time value. Let's just call it published equals null. Then after we check if the slug exists, let's write another if statement, checking to see if the date time or the date published value is not empty or white space. Because if it's not, then we want to use that value for the published. So we'll set published equals to datetime.parse. We will pass in date published, and then we will use this published variable as the value passed to the add method. And that should be sufficient for our create post. Let's copy this code and let's paste it as edit post. We still need the title, the content, the slug, the date published, and the author ID. But now we don't want to retrieve the item based upon the slug. We want to use the ID. And we don't have that value. So that is another field that we need to add to our form. So let's make this a hidden field. So input type hidden. And we will set the name equal to post ID. And then the value equal to @post.id. And then in the post handler, we need to get to that value. So let's add another variable inside of our process request method. Let's just call this ID. We want context.request.form, and then we want post ID. Now, whenever we create a blank post, I believe we set the ID to 0. So let's look at that. Let's see ID. We don't have anything for the ID, but it should default as, well, no. Let's go ahead and set ID equal to 0. That way we know that we have a post that is a new post. And we really only need that ID value whenever we are editing a post. So let's make this the first parameter for the edit post method. So that means in our definition, we need to add int ID. We will get a post based upon the ID instead of the slug. We still need to parse the date published variable. So we will still have our published variable initialized as null. We no longer need to check to see if it's not null. Well, actually, yeah, we do, because we might be trying to edit a post that does not exist. So let's say if result equals null, then let's throw a 404 because this resource does not exist. So then we can say that post does not exist. Then we parse the date published string, which is what we want to do. But instead of adding a new post, we want to edit a post. So we can call post repository. Now we don't have this method yet, but we can call edit. And we can pass the ID, the title, the content, the slug, the published, and the author. So let's go to our post repository class. Let's copy the code that we have for adding a new post. Let's paste it in. Let's change the name from add to edit. And we want to add the ID parameter. And then we want to change our SQL statement. So instead of using an insert statement, we want to update posts. We need to set title equal to, let's say, parameter 0, so at 0. Let's set the content to the second parameter. Date published will be the third parameter. Author ID will be the fourth. And then finally, slug will be the fifth. And then we need our where clause. We need to set these values where ID equals to parameter 6. And let's format this on multiple lines just so that it's easier to see all on one screen. So we are setting title, content, date published, author ID, and slug, where ID is equal to that value. So we just need to tack on ID as the final value to db.execute, and that should be that. Well, let's try to run this and see if we get any errors. And we do. So let's see. Both are in posthandler.cs. This first one cannot convert a string to int. So here we need to convert our ID value. So let's just use the convert class and then to int 32. And that will solve that particular problem. And then we have another one. Let's see, post handler edit post has some invalid arguments. Well, that's the same thing. So let's try to run this now. And everything's building. Awesome. So let's fire up SQL Server Management Studio just so that we can see the data that we are going to be working with. And inside of the browser, let's go to admin and then post and edit first post. Now, of course, we know that showing the form does indeed work because we tested that in the previous lesson. But now we are going to actually test this. So let's change the title from first post to first post and then changed. Let's also change the content. And let's add another line and say that this has been, actually no, let's not, because in SQL Server that might be a little bit difficult to see. So let's make this the first thing as changed in parentheses and then whatever we had before. The slug, let's add dash and then changed. And then for date published, let's add an actual date. Let's do year, month, and then day. And let's submit. Yes, we do get an exception. So an exception of type format exception occurred with the date time. So it did not like our year, month, day value. So let's continue on. This is going to show the error inside of the browser. Let's go back and let's change this so that we have some slashes here. So year / month / day, and then let's try to submit this once again. Hopefully that will pass, and it does not for another reason. Let's see here. There's an incorrect syntax near title. And that would be because there's no set operator there. So let's stop running and let's add update posts set title equal parameter content and so on and so forth. So now let's run this once again. Let's go back to admin, post, edit, and then first post. And we have to change all of this once again. So let's do changed, and then at the beginning, we'll do changed. And then for the slug, we will add a dash changed. And then for the date published, 2014/05/17. So let's click on submit, and we still get an exception. Must declare the scalar variable at 6. Well, I thought that we did. Let's see, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's our problem. Okay, so we have title, we have content, date published, author ID, slug, ID. Well, the positions are adding up, but let's see, 0, 1, 3. Apparently I cannot count. So we need to change these values. And now finally, let's run this again. Hopefully everything will now change. We are at least getting to the point of executing the SQL statement, which that's very promising. We just have to actually change the values for that SQL statement now. So let's once again make sure that we are changing things so that we can make sure that our code works. And 17 for the date published, submit, and there we go. We did not get any exceptions. So if we go to the database table, let's open up the posts table, and let's see the values that we have here now. Our title was changed, the content was changed, date created was not modified, but date published was. Author ID is still 1, and then the slug was changed as well. So editing posts works. Let's add a new post. Let's set the title to second post. The content can just be anything. Let's not assign a slug, and let's not assign a date published. So if we click on submit, we get no errors. Let's run the SQL statement again, and there we have our second post. Let's do this one more time, because we want to ensure that everything is working, especially if we are supplying a slug and supplying a date published. So the title will be third post, content, doesn't matter what it is. For the slug, let's do post third, and then for the date published, let's just do the date that we did before, 05 and then 17. And if we submit, we get no errors. If we run the SQL statement again, the title is third post, content is howdy, date created, date published, and then the slug is post third. So everything is working just fine. And the beauty of it all is that now we have our data access code separated inside of its own class, so that whenever we need to interact with the database, we just use our post repository class, and we have some very simple methods that we can use to get posts, to edit them, and to create them. Now we just need to add the ability to delete a post, and we will do that in the next lesson.